Okay, welcome back again, everyone. This is the section just before Professor Ruth Stewart joins us, where I remind us a little bit of how to get involved in EIS, and then I'm doing a little handover to Jane. So, firstly, again, good morning, UK, Europe. I hope Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Southeast Asia, everybody's still hanging in there. Good morning, South Africa. I just want, again, for the people that have just joined us now, thank our partners for the conference, in particular Victorian Government here in Melbourne, and the National University of Singapore, who have started a Institute for Behavioural and Implementation Interventions. And in addition to all our other partners, we couldn't be hosting this event without you. Next slide. So for the people that are new to this, there's a little bit of a trick to making your experience seamless. And those of us that have been doing this today, I found it super easy, and we've been getting great feedback. You have 40 hours of pre-recorded content that you can watch anytime, but you will also have a series of live events. Unlike watching a conference on YouTube, you have to deliberately come in and out of a session. So after Ruth is finished, you click finish or leave, I think, that session, and then you click view when you want to go back into another session. So you just have to kind of be a little bit of active using your timeline on your platform to come in and out. We have a 24/7 meeting hub where you can join and meet other colleagues and network. We have a great Q&A tab for the live discussions. I can see some of you have started using that already. We have discussion forums, and I'm going to talk about them as a highlight to Jane today. They have been very well attended, and might be something that people want to see a little bit more of. And importantly, you have a live support team, which will be with you the entire time the conference is running, that will help you with any of your technical issues. So it's just, you'll get the best out of this if you just learn how to run that platform easily. Should we have Jane join us now? And I will... Good morning, Jane Lewis from the UK, from London. How is it there today?
Well, it's wonderful. It's going to be 24 degrees in London, and we've got a sensational program of content. So
that is warmer than it was in Melbourne today. We only got to 20 degrees. What's going on?
Well, it's the heat of EIS.
And yeah, the Twitter streams. Jane, let me take you through a few highlights from today, and sort of ease you into then introducing Ruth and going off with your the rest of the conference. We opened up with a terrific keynote from Renard Fidayas, who really, it's well worth those of you joining us now watching her keynote later on. She took us through a terrific kind of journey of evidence in mental health and studying which bits of implementation matter. People really took on the idea that organizational context really matters in terms of whether something will be implemented, sustained, if we're talking about evidence-based practices with mental health, but so does leadership behaviors and authorizing environments. So she took it sort of beyond the traditional workforce training. Followed after that, we hosted a panel that I was on with Renard and two other colleagues. That was lively. That was interesting. It was the question of whether behavioural science and implementation science better together or apart. And of course, you can imagine we all went together, but that is hopefully a good hour of viewing. And we broke off into these terrific groups. And I had some people send me highlights of things that they heard today that really sort of stuck with them. So if you forgive me, I'm going to read some of these. Culture, this is a famous quote, but culture eats strategy for breakfast, kept coming up a number of times. The absolute urgency in investing in mental health. So Renard reminded us this morning, if not now, when? Increasing our investment in mental health, the fiscal strain that the system is under to be able to deliver evidenced approaches really kind of came through in her talk. There was something slightly depressing, which I'm hoping Ruth is going to solve in her next keynote, is there was a point around all policy eventually fails that came up and was retweeted a number of times. And I don't know if that person was tired or how people necessarily, but that might be something for Ruth to tackle. And there was a lot throughout the day, Jane, a lot of discussion around co-design and collaboration and genuine co-design and when it can go well and when it can go bad, and the importance of that for effective implementation. And there was a quote that really stuck with some people today: co-design and lived experience, all talk and no action, especially at the margins. And that was paraphrased by someone who spoke, one of the panels. There seems to be a bit of a feel of a disappointment around how, whether the concept of co-design, co-creation is lived up to what it could be and how genuinely it is done. There was really some excellent work around engagement and identifying champions. The talk, I don't know if you just watched, John, then, it was the reality of politicians and whether, have they got time for evidence? Is it translated enough? Is it even urgent? What's researchers' role? And the discussion panels, this is where people go into a live discussion. They have hopefully been able to view some of the content that will be discussed, and some of the speakers may be there. They have been very well attended. So despite what we were expecting, in some we've had up to 80 people joining those discussion forums in one forum. So I think our facilitators have been thrilled and slightly daunted at trying to navigate that many people. So that's been a terrific highlight. And again, those of you that have just joined us, please follow the hashtag EIS 2021 feed to see what people were tweeting about today, and continue to tweet into your day so you can share content with your colleagues. Jane, we have over 750 people today, could be more, multi-countries, and I think it's pretty exciting, the content that you'll be going into. Do you have some highlights or some things you'd like to raise now?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it is just incredibly exciting to be able to extend the programme across European, African, and then later on American time zones in the way that we have. EIS has always been global, but this feels like it's taking global to a new dimension. And we've got some really great stuff coming up today. So next up is Professor Ruth Stewart from the Africa Centre for Evidence and the Africa Evidence Network, talking about how policy implementation, evidence and politics come together in South Africa. And that's going to be a really thought-provoking session. I think lots of resonance probably with what John's been talking about as well. Then we've got 2 sets of panels and discussions, so loads of content for people to choose between. We'll have a break, which we've put in deliberately so that people like me that slept while you guys were working hard can catch up on some of the great content that will be online. And then this afternoon, we've got an invited panel on evidence and policy, again, building on what John and then what Ruth will have to say. So we have Professor Annette Bowers, who's an academic who's held many really interesting posts in government as well. We've got Professor Becky Francis from the Education Endowment Foundation, one of the What Works centres that John referred to, and Chris Webber from the Open Innovation team, which does really interesting work within government. And then we have a final keynote for the day, which is Professor Mary Dixon Woods from the Health Improvement Studies Institute, talking about future directions to improve healthcare systems, which will be a really terrific talk. I've had a preview of her slides, and they'll be absolutely terrific. So that's what we've got lined up today.
Well, we have some great news for you, given that you do have that break, is that the very skilled technical support and this is going to make me sound like an old woman, people recording everything. My sons would be like, oh God, really? Have actually already managed to get all the recorded content up. So everything that occurred today, from here on in, participants are able to watch yourselves. So those of you that are able to take a break and aren't getting swamped by meetings might want to watch some of the talks that happened today. And again, in particular, I'd highlight some of the keynotes. A further highlight I wanted to add that I left off before was, you'll see if you follow on Twitter, I was quite torn. There were 2 UNICEF panels that happened at the same time, just in the previous. And wow, both of them were just terrific. Congratulations to Kerry Albright and her colleagues. Both of them showed what a very large, humongous institution of an organization, what they're doing to try and really think about using evidence, using better evidence, and now moving their thinking towards implementation. And it was just, I'd encourage everybody to sort of just spend some time watching each. Some of the evidence they're generating, well, most of it is for a public good, and I'll highlight those evidence and gap maps that the Campbell Collaboration and UNICEF have been doing together as a public good to speed up the use of what we know about what works and where our gaps are. But there was also some really interesting in the other panel conversations about different types of evidence products, which they were, and this is what I mean by the way the evidence is synthesized. So there was a lot of talk about rapid evidence assessments. There was talk about reviews of reviews. And then, and trying to tailor what kind of evidence product you generate based on the questions, the resource and time. So really thinking quite flexibly in terms of how they synthesize, and then how it informs their decision making, which was very exciting, given again just how big UNICEF is and what a big influence they have on the ecosystem we all work in. So I'd also encourage, all the panels were great. I don't want to pick some over others because that would seem awful. But a couple of really, really big highlights. So have a fabulous day. I am staying online because there's just too much good content coming up. I imagine people in Australia and through to Singapore. I think Australians, it's okay to let your children watch screens tonight. We only have the EIS once every 2 years. So I say if ever to use iPads, now's the time. Jane enjoyed today very much. I think Ruth will seamlessly be coming into this room, joining you for an introduction and her keynote, and grateful that you're able to pick this up and I can go and get a little bit of beauty sleep.
Oh, wonderful, Robin. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for that catch up on all the highlights so far. You've been working hard. Everyone's been
so
working
much more
hard.
to come. So much more to come.
Yeah.
I'm going to assume, so Jane, this is where I'm going to expose it gets slightly awkward because something's going to happen now, as in Ruth's going to join us. If you watch the opening address, we had a little bit of a timing blip this morning, which will give everybody a laugh. We're going to go to a holding slide first, and there'll be music, and then you'll be back in 30 seconds.
Wonderful. Well, hello everybody, and thank you for joining this session. I'm Jane Lewis, one of the directors at the Centre for Evidence and Implementation, and it's my enormous pleasure to be hosting EIS through the next 8 hours or so, and an even bigger pleasure to be welcoming Professor Ruth Stewart to this keynote. Hello, Ruth. Fabulous to see you. Thank you so much. So Professor Ruth Stewart is the director of the Africa Centre for Evidence based at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. She's also the founder and the chair of the Africa Evidence Network, which brings together thousands of people across Africa whose work supports evidence-informed decision-making. Ruth just has absolutely enormous expertise at working at the coalface to support evidence-informed decision-making. She's been really instrumental in the increasing institutionalization of evidence use within South Africa, and we've just been hearing from John Thwaites about how important that is. And Ruth's also been involved in a number of other globally significant initiatives around evidence use. Most importantly, you'll get an incredibly strong sense of her vision and her values throughout her session. And also, I think, about how much the Global North can learn from the Global South about excellence in evidence use in policy making. So really delighted that you're able to join us, Ruth. Thank you so much. Just before I hand over to you, to help people to get familiar with the setup for folks who are new with joining EIS for your talk, to the right of your screens, you'll see a live Q&A section. If you want to pose a question or a comment, then just please type it away there. And after Ruth's finished, we'll pick up on those questions. You can also vote for other people's questions, and that will help us to direct Ruth's attention to the things that folks most want to hear about. There's also a discussion forum for making comments and sharing your thoughts. If you need any kind of technical assistance, we've got a live support team on the go throughout, and you'll see a red icon at the top of your screen where you can access live support. And today's session is being recorded, as are all the sessions. And so worst case scenario, if anything goes wrong, you can always catch Ruth's talk afterwards. So Ruth will talk for about 35 minutes. I might not be able to stop myself asking a couple of questions, and then we'll go to the questions in the Q&A section. So please do type away there. And so Ruth, thank you so much for joining us. It's an enormous pleasure and a privilege to have you here. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jane, for the warm introduction. It's lovely to be here. I should say good morning and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us. And as we're big on formal protocol here in Africa, and I would normally be walking up onto stage and formally thanking you, Madam Chair, and the officials, whether from parliaments or governments or other esteemed colleagues. So observing protocol and acknowledging the audience here today. I would also want to declare that I have no known conflicts of interest, except of course that my research and the work that I do is almost entirely externally funded. I'm a university employee, and in many ways what I'm talking to you about today is my life's work. So I'm not sure if that makes me highly conflicted, but it certainly makes me highly invested. It's a huge credit to my team at the Africa Centre for Evidence that I'm here today and I'm able to share work. So I want to acknowledge them, and also to the wider Africa Evidence Network, a community who are passionate about the use of evidence in decision making, and without whom I would have very little to share with you today. I also want to thank my partners in this particular work, which is also being written up amongst us as a paper, and we hope to be able to share with you before too long. Harsha Dayal, Lawrence Langer, and Karina van Rooyen. This is your work too, and in different circumstances, I would be asking you to stand and acknowledge your contribution. So thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're sitting comfortably and have a fresh coffee, especially those of you who are joining early in the morning. Let's begin. First I must work out how to scroll my slides from one to the other. There we are, fantastic. So I would like to understand if there's anyone out there. This is a very strange forum to be presenting in, and I can't see my audience. I don't like it very much, I'll be honest. And Jane, I believe you've already popped some polls up on the on-air platform, and I would encourage you to respond there. I hope that you have access to at least one of the questions, if not all three. I'm taking a look at the platform myself now, and I see that a number of people are responding to the first poll. And this is asking you where you work. Do you work in government, in a university, in a research organization that isn't a university? And I know there's a significant part of our work, but also maybe for a civil society organization or for another organization altogether. And I can see these findings coming in. If you were off making coffee, just come to your screen and tick an option. I see the votes are rising. I'm just going to wait another 10 seconds or so for anyone who was just getting a fresh cup of tea. And then Jane, I'm hoping you might be able to display the results. Are you able to do that on the screen, or is this something that we can access from the platform? Okay, that's fine. I understand that we're not able to display them. So let me tell you, because it's actually very interesting. At the moment, there's 22% of people who are working in government, around 29 in a university, and 16% in another research organization. So still a large body of researchers. We're looking at kind of 45, 50% researchers, 21% in civil society, and 8 others. I'd love to know who you are. So thank you very much for telling us a little bit about who you are. And I'm really glad that there's a significant number of people here today who are working in government, because as far as I'm concerned, you're the heroes of today, and I'd like to acknowledge you especially. I'm going to ask, and I hope that you're able to do this for me, Jane, that we actually switch that poll off and we look at the next question, which is about enabling people to just indicate on your screen, don't walk away yet, which continent you're based in. And I know that this time zone is particularly in between. So I'm hoping that those of you in Australia and Asia are still with us in the evening, but also I know there's an audience joining in the UK. I'm wondering if that's a poll that you're able to switch over. If not, I think I can. Let's see if that happens. Okay, I'm fairly sure that I can switch this over. So let's see. Yeah. So the next one is available, and I hope it's up on your screen. Brilliant. I'm seeing the findings already. So we still have a large audience from Australia and the surrounds who are online. Fantastic. And thank you for staying with us this evening. The Asians and Australians are with us, but I see the Europeans are waking up too. And I am particular welcome to those of you joining us from Africa. Not so many. There's even at least one person in North America. So well done. I think it must be very late or very early in the morning for you. The time zones stretch our brains a little bit. But welcome and great to have you with us. I'm now going to switch on the very last poll, which is just to understand a little bit about how you see yourself. Do you see yourself as an evidence user primarily, a knowledge broker, an evidence producer? Often we call ourselves researchers, but maybe there are many forms of evidence production or something else altogether. And I hope that that poll, I've just clicked a button called start. So I hope that just popped up on your screen and you're able to indicate there. Brilliant. Suddenly got populated very quickly. So you must be sitting at your screens and someone's had coffee because your fingers are moving quickly. Oh, it's changing fast though. Okay, so I've got, it keeps changing. I'm seeing the percentages. So around 30% of you are evidence users. Around 40% are knowledge brokers, which is very exciting because that means you're working in that space between these worlds, or maybe just moving between them frequently, which is largely what I do. And there's about 35% who are evidence producers. And then there's at least one person who's none of these. And again, I'd love to know who you are. So thank you very much for sharing a little bit about who you are. This world of Zoom isn't ideal. And I'm sorry that we can't put the lights up and see your faces. As I said previously, I really do consider decision makers, those in government and in other organizations where you're making sense of evidence to shape policy and implementation. You really are the stars of this show. So please take a virtual bow. Now I just have to change, there we are. So you'll have heard mentioned and seen on the blurb, I lead the Africa Centre for Evidence in Johannesburg, linked to the university here. And unfortunately, our offices look a little bit like this at the moment. Since COVID struck, we have been largely locked down. We are a research centre affiliated to the university, but largely externally funded. And our vision is to contribute to solutions to tackle poverty and inequality through greater use of evidence. And we do that through greater understanding of the art and science of using evidence, building stronger evidence capacities, meaningful evidence communities, and producing rigorous and relevant evidence syntheses. My team, fortunately, in a previous era, are rather more groomed, and you'll see the grass was much shorter when we took this picture. There's actually around 25 of us, and additional affiliates as well, mostly based here in Johannesburg, but also elsewhere. So it's really the work of this fantastic team that I'm sharing with you today. So I'm talking about the institutionalization of evidence use. And so I've got a couple of quotes for you here. Interestingly, the screen is blocking one of mine. So one of them is from a colleague of ours from Burkina Faso, who writes about the process by which activities become integral and sustainable part of a formal system. And another quote here from Kuhn and colleagues that says institutionalization is structures and standardized practices that encourage the continuation of particular activities. And you'll note the process, the activities, integral, sustainable, structures, standardized practices, continuation. So there's a whole set of activities that need to take place for institutionalization to happen, and they need to be routine. Now, I noted in reading around institutionalization that a really great comment, and I'm sorry I don't have a reference for it, but around the fact that there's always a history to institutionalization. And largely what I'm sharing with you today is around trying to understand best some of the history to the institutionalization of evidence use in South Africa. And I'd love to hear from you later on when I finish talking around how this is working in your own context and what your reflections are and what I've got to share. Now, before I continue, I hope you'll indulge me a little while. We're all a bit fed up. COVID's been around for a while and I want to have a bit of a moan. Now your microphones are off, so please feel free to join in. No one will know. Things are not okay. There's a whole set of things that are not okay. Poverty and inequality are not okay. And these are getting worse before our eyes because of COVID. Whether it's racism or xenophobia or inequality, these are fundamental issues. And I think it's really important that we keep our eyes on these things that are not okay when we think about how we do our work. Isolation is also not okay. It's not okay that we work in silos, that we separate government and academia with high walls, that we forget about citizens and communities, that researchers consider themselves to be the top of some imaginary hierarchy. There's been so much isolation this year because of lockdowns and because of COVID, but professional isolation's been around for a while. We work in silos, we exclude one another, we use fancy language, we protect our ivory towers, patronize one another. We largely ignore the global south, and we perpetuate this colonial deficit model that assumes that the global south requires help and aid. And I just think that's not the case. I'm very proud of the Africa Evidence Network and its strapline, which says that only together can evidence-informed decision-making become a reality. Now, John Thwaites was speaking before me, talked a little bit about systematic reviews, and my background is in evidence synthesis. And I take on board some of his critique of systematic reviews being fairly impenetrable when it comes to particularly decision makers in government. But just because evidence synthesis might be challenging, that doesn't mean that relying on a single study is okay. It's not okay. We know from a number of scandals that have been very high profile, MMR is one of them, and Donald Trump's support for various cures for COVID is another. But these are all scenarios where too much weight has been given to a single study and there hasn't been understanding of the full evidence base. Now, I regularly draw on the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie when I talk about this, because she has a TED Talk, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's called The Danger of a Single Story, and she's talking about stereotypes. Now, I've pinched her language, because what she says about stereotypes is so true also for single studies. And what she says is it's not that they are inaccurate, but that they are incomplete. And if we're looking to shape decisions that affect thousands, millions, sometimes even billions of people, we need to be really serious about understanding the full evidence base. There are methods and tools and expertise, online libraries of systematically collated evidence bases. And some of them may be slightly impenetrable and some of them may be more accessible, but that doesn't mean we don't have an obligation to understand what the full evidence base says when we're looking to shape policy and practice. This is my big one at the moment. Sidelining decision makers is not okay. They are not the extra in evidence-informed decision-making and implementation. Decision makers and decision-making are the whole point of what we're trying to do. We too often neglect and actually exclude these crucial players. We're not children in a playground, and their opinion is not less valuable just because they don't have a PhD in research methodology. Thank you very much. My moan is over. Let's move on and let the sunshine in. Have a swig of coffee and sit back. So today I'm going to talk to you about South Africa, and I want to first give you a bit of a flavour about why I live and work in South Africa. I've lived and worked on several continents, and I've made South Africa my home and committed much of my work and career to this country and this continent, and there are good reasons why. What you've got up on your screen, and I'll read it for you, I know it's quite small, is the vision from South Africa's National Development Plan. And this is South Africa's, so the National Development Plan lays out in great detail, a little bit like the SDGs, but for South Africa specifically, the country that we're aiming to build. And this is part of the vision, and I'm going to read it to you. It says, now in 2030, we live in a country which we have remade. We have created a home where everyone feels free, yet bounded to others, where everyone embraces their full potential. We are proud to be a community that cares. We have received the mixed legacy of inequalities in opportunity and in where we have lived, but we have agreed to change the narrative of conquest, oppression, and resistance. Now, I find this very inspiring. And to be honest, having had my moan about things that are not okay, I work in South Africa because there is a commitment here to try and tackle these things that are not okay. Whether it's tackling poverty and inequality head on, learning from others across the continent in a very open and capacity sharing approach, whether it's around embracing evidence bases, knowledge bases within government, and that's happening right from the center of government, as I'm going to explain, but also ensuring that decision makers are the center. And as I'll show you, the drive for the use of evidence in decision making is largely coming from within the center of government and not being projected by academics from the outside. This is no ordinary country, and this is why I choose to work here. Now, I've been talking about the institutionalization of evidence here, and I want to tell you a little bit about what this looks like. I don't want to pretend that it doesn't have pitfalls, that it works perfectly, but this is really exciting. The use of evidence in decision making is mandated. All proposals for new and revised policies in government, anything that goes before cabinet, must be assessed for its potential impacts using the best available evidence. This is amazing. Policies are weighed according to the relative impacts, cost-benefit analysis is undertaken, implementation is planned. Now, this is significant, particularly as I know we have implementation specialists here. This is not just about making policy. This is also about thinking through its implementation and potential risks to that implementation. And a baseline is established before the new policy is approved. And that allows constant monitoring and evaluation to take place. This situation is supported by guidance and training for those government officials who are involved in using this process for assessing, for drafting policies and assessing them, and for conducting ongoing assessments. There is explicit guidance on evidence management as part of this system. And this is really spot on evidence. This is about, and I'm quoting for you, it says within this guidance, this is about the use of timely, relevant, and quality evidence at the heart of public policy making. There is a theory of change, and there is detail on how evidence needs to be embraced and sought and embraced and understood at each stage of the policy formulation process. Evidence maps, evidence synthesis are integrated within that explicit guidance on evidence management. And thirdly, and this is a very recent development, there is a new national policy framework which codifies, and again I quote, codifies policymaking practices and entrenches evidence-based policymaking. South Africa has the backbones in place for institutionalization of evidence use throughout government policy. Now, I've been talking a lot, and I think that's about enough from me. I'd like to introduce to you two colleagues from the presidency here in South Africa, Polani Kole and Jan Magoro. And I'm going to ask our tech team to play a video of a conversation I had with them recently. Over to Polani, and thank you very much, team.
Greetings, Prof. My name is Polani Kule. I'm the Chief Policy Analyst in the Presidency, Policy and Research Services, and responsible for the Socio-Economic Impact Assessment System.
My name is Jan Maoro. I work for the Presidency under Policy and Research Services. I'm responsible for Socio-Economic Impact Assessment System, CS.
The Socio-Economic Impact Assessment System, which we call it SEAS, is an ex-ante policy analysis tool that helps departments to improve the policy formulation concepts, and it also critique the policy itself or the draft bill, to ensure that the risks and the costs that are associated with such policy proposals are minimized, so that there is greater benefits of ensuring that we address 3 socioeconomic challenges of poverty, high levels of unemployment, and inequality in the country.
CS was a major step in South Africa in encouraging government officials to think about impacts of their respective policies before approval. And it resulted in a paradigm shift as officials were encouraged to think critically about the impact of their policies, risks associated with those policies, and most importantly, how those policies are going to be implemented, meaning they are forced to do cost-benefit analysis and plan for implementation of their policies. And this has led to improvement in terms of how we manage policy management in South Africa.
In the CS application, you have 2 assessment templates, which are called Initial Impact Assessment, as well as the Final Impact Assessment. So the Initial Impact Assessment is applied at early stages of identifying a particular problem or opportunity, and it requires a lot of evidence to understand the nature of the problem. It also looks into the groups of society that are being affected by that particular problem, which also require evidence. And also it requires the use of evidence in terms of options of addressing that particular problem. So not every problem that is experienced requires a new policy, and evidence have to demonstrate in terms of what are the current initiatives and why are they not working. So it's a process that requires the use of evidence. But also in terms of option analysis, it requires evidence in a way that you have to do research in terms of how did other institutions or other countries address the similar problem that you are trying to address in the country. So we call it a kind of a benchmarking exercise which require evidence, but also other evidence will come from the evaluations. It might be implementation evaluation or impact evaluation on a particular program that the evidence tells that maybe you need to review your policy or legislation. So that's the nature of CS, that you know it doesn't require us to use to some thug or use emotions, but we have to be guided by evidence. And the very same evidence becomes a baseline in terms of tracking whether your policy initiative is making a difference as you implement post the approval.
Okay. Cabinet of the South African government approved the National Policy Development Framework last year in December to serve as a blueprint on how to develop public policies in South Africa, taking into account the importance of evidence, consultation with affected stakeholders, and interdepartmental consultation, and also thinking about implementation and planning for evaluation of those policies from the outset. The framework is a major step in South Africa in entrenching best policymaking practices, and it guides officials on how a policy document is supposed to look like, and it introduces principles to be adhered to when designing public policy, as well as coming up with some standards to ensure that public policy is properly streamlined and expedited. With SIAS, we have seen instrumental use of evidence, particularly in the field of health, education, and environment. Just to elaborate more on the environment, as you know, in terms of climate change, there was a requirement to address green gas emissions, and the Department of Environmental Affairs had to come up with national adaptation strategy that involved various government departments to ensure that when they come up with their policies, strategies, programs, they also think about climate change. And through that process, SIAS was instrumental to ensure that evidence use featured predominantly, and also it encouraged interdepartmental consultation.
Excellent. Thank you very much to my colleagues Palani and Jan from the presidency in South Africa. And I wish I could have played more of that video. We had a fascinating conversation with a number of examples of how this SEAS system is allowing evidence to be brought into the routine interrogation of policy proposals. And I think perhaps most significant for a country that has one of the most unequal societies in the world, that process formally requires consideration of who the winners and losers are for each and every evidence, each and every policy proposal that is considered. So let me just check for some reason. There we are. Sorry, I'm scanning my slides too quickly. There we are. So we know that South Africa has made significant advances in institutionalizing evidence use. And I didn't give you dates, but that SEAS system was introduced back in 2015. The most recent new policy development framework came in only in December last year. So some of this is new, but it has also been around for a while. And it's allowed my colleagues and I to explore a little bit about what has led to this and what is impacted by this institutionalization. And we've pulled out 4 themes which link very closely to the conference themes that you're experiencing yesterday and today, around advances in evidence co-production, developments towards evidence implementation, new policies that build on very strong foundations, and what I'm calling politics with a small p. So the first of these is around advances in evidence production, and I'm specifically really thinking about evidence co-production. I want to use the analogy of cooking, because when we have worked to co-produce evidence for decision-making, we've found we introduce new ingredients when we work together. We refine recipes together, we add new flavors, and as with much cooking, we build and strengthen relationships. So we know from our work that perhaps the first step that took place here in South Africa, and I think it's true for many people, what I consider to be an absolute minimum, is getting your evidence into formats that's useful for decision makers and decision making. The second thing we've observed are real advances in ensuring that research questions are policy driven. And again, this is new for some, but I would argue that this is an essential basic, that we need to be engaging more with policymakers and those who work in government to understand not just what questions they have, and they're very different from the kinds of academic research questions that we might come up with sitting in our university offices, but also to understand the policy framework, the policy options, and how elements like the National Development Plan and the SDGs and other outcome frameworks that different governments might have drive the process of what kinds of research questions need to be addressed. We've also observed and engaged with, as part of this co-production, a broader interpretation of what counts as evidence. And this might be shocking to some academics who like to think that what evidence is fit into very clear categories, but I think it's very clear to most of us in this work that we're not just talking about randomized control trials, and we need to challenge our own understanding of what counts as evidence and knowledge when we think about how we shape decision making. We have thought about how we produce research and the process of producing research, and have made a number of advances in this area. We have a process known as evidence, which we could call evidence co-production, and our government colleagues have driven a process called matchmaking of how researchers and those in government can work together. We've seen a shift to responsive evidence services, and this shift has happened within government. It's not been driven from outside. And this has moved beyond responsive evidence outputs. It's not about one piece of research anymore or one research report. It's about a responsive evidence service that provides evidence to decision makers when they need it. And we've used co-production as a way of making sure that these evidence outputs, but also the evidence services, are policy relevant. And lastly, we've learned an enormous amount amongst ourselves and with other colleagues in government, from them and with them, and amongst our broader evidence ecosystem in South Africa. These advances in evidence co-production have helped to shift institutionalization because they've largely been driven by government. This is not a push from outside. We've seen a move from shaping research practices together to shaping research-informed decision-making practices together. And we've seen a move from individual policies where there was a particular policy moment and we engage in co-production to try and ensure that it was evidence-based, to policy-making systems and shaping how those systems work. And lastly, we've moved from individual projects, which might bring together academics and colleagues in government, to much stronger state and research partnerships, which are starting to form. If we look at developments towards evidence implementation, we have seen a critical mass of internal and external initiatives that focus not on the production of evidence, but on its use. And these have been going on for 10 to 15 years across the country. And you can see a buildup across a timeline of more and more initiatives. We've also seen how relationships have grown and broken down barriers between producers and users, so that we really can phone up a colleague in the presidency and say, would you mind going on camera? I've got to do a keynote and unfortunately I can't bring you with me, and they will happily oblige. And it's to do with a trust and relationship that has been built over many years. And last but not least, when we think about evidence implementation, there have been significant increases in capacities for evidence-informed decision-making that span evidence use and evidence production and everything in between. We've seen a shift towards externally funded and time-bound initiatives, towards internal ones that are driven within government. We've seen a shift from internal relationships to institutionalized ones, and this is something we need to be continually working on. And we've seen a shift from individual capacities to team capacities, organization capacities, and we're beginning to think on an institutionalized level about evidence capacities as well. If we move to think about specific policies, and I really mentioned these already, in fact, my government colleagues did a much better job than I did. but we're building on a foundation of policies that underpin evidence-informed decision-making. And these are really foundational, whether it's our National Development Plan or the SEA system, or these more recent developments around how we use evidence and the National Policy Development Framework itself. That National Policy Development Framework is a how-to. It tells you about how to engage with evidence, critique it, and understand it. So we've seen an interest in evidence and its integration into specific policy areas, and we've seen significant new policies that really grounds the use of evidence in policy making at that institutional level. Now, last but not least, when we think about evidence politics, and I say this with a small p because I've not worked in government, I'm not a politician, and I'm relatively ignorant. This is where I learned from my government colleagues, and I can tell you now that I have a lot more to learn. And I'd love to hear some responses when we have a chance in a moment. But what we do have is an understanding that our relationships are really important. And we've been working and guided by colleagues in government about the careful management of politics. And John Thwaites, who spoke before me, had a lot more to say about this. And I think if you have a chance, you should go back and listen to his talk. He talked about the importance of taking time to understand that political environment. And I think as academics, there's a particular lesson in this, to not assume that we know best, because we really don't. Now, South Africa has an amazing foundation of a drive towards pro-poor policymaking and an increasingly transparent policy context. And this builds on, this builds on a commitment to improving the lives of South Africans through the provision of a strong state at the heart of government. Now, I am sure some of my colleagues might be embarrassed for me to say this, but it's really striking to me that many of the key figures within the evidence ecosystem in South Africa, in a previous world, when there were struggles against the apartheid government, were willing to put their lives on the line, and many of them went to jail for what they believe, in a commitment to provide a strong state. And that commitment and that service of their country remains a driver to tackle poverty and inequality, and to do that through the greater use of evidence. And that's a really extraordinary thing to be able to be part of. And last but not least, that translates to a drive for good governance and a capable state. We know that we've struggled with issues of corruption, and we know that the relatively new democracy in South Africa struggles with particular issues. It's still very young, but the drive for good governance and a capable state also drives the use of evidence in decision-making, and that's an extraordinary environment to be part of. Now, I have to confess that this is perhaps the area that I think is least well developed in my own understanding and that of my colleagues. And it'd be really interesting to hear reflections from you as an audience around this particular issue. So has any of this made a difference? Well, we know that evidence co-production, implementation, policies and politics have helped to shape institutionalization of evidence. And we have a number of examples about how this has led over the last 10 years to improved policies and their implementation that have affected the lives of South Africans. This has included the COVID response, and the chair of the President's COVID Advice Committee here recently was awarded the John Maddox Prize, along with Anthony Fauci from the US, for communicating the complex and changing science of COVID to the public and policymakers. So that we've seen the use of evidence in the country's COVID response. We've seen the use of evidence from randomized control trials and evidence synthesis shape a youth wage subsidy, which we know improved the chances of young people staying in work. And that has led to a South African employment tax incentive since January 2014. We know that evidence has been used to shape the human settlements policy, and where the Department for Human Settlements has really challenged a white paper that was put before Cabinet, but didn't take into account the full evidence base within South Africa. And by producing a systematic evidence map, we have helped to contribute to reconsidering of some of those policy options. And last but not least, there's a lovely example around how evidence has been used to shape early grade reading, which has potentially impacted on millions of preschool and primary school age children. So this integrated use of evidence has the potential for so much more impact, and we're really excited about the latest developments here in South Africa and looking forward to seeing what they make. So in all of this work, we have learned a few things, and I'd love to be able to open this up and hear more from our colleagues in the audience. We know that shared values and a desire to tackle poverty and inequality are at the heart of this work in South Africa towards the institutionalization of evidence use. We know that decision makers and decision making have to be at the center of what we do. These are not passive recipients of knowledge. We also have learned that institutionalization isn't something that just happens in government. We aren't looking from the outside into government and saying change, institutionalize, but the institutionalization of evidence and policymaking has to happen throughout the evidence-informed decision-making process. And last but not least, we continue to seek to understand and invest in relationships and to move from doing that at an individual level to organizational and institutional levels. So I'd love to hear whether any of these reflections resonate with you. And I'm going to close. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you'll engage further with the work that we do. Thank you, Jane. Over to you.
Indeed. Thank you, Ruth. That was just absolutely wonderful. Just such a kind of rich vision and values-led account of an amazing approach to institutionalizing the use of evidence in a country, in a sort of sense of the kind of unique history of South Africa and how that's contributed to this absolutely incredible endeavor as well. We've got lots of questions coming in, but I wanted to ask a question first of all about, I loved the greetings, Prof. How wonderful to have every day start with that. I wanted to ask first of all about how government supported the use of EIS when it was first introduced, and what was done to introduce it, and how it's been supported, and how the nature of that support has needed to change over time since it was brought in.
It's an excellent question. So there's been a training program. So perhaps the first thing is to say is that it was developed in a central government department outside of the president's office initially, and it's moved into the presidency, which has given it a really significant status. It has been supported by training programs. So we have a decentralized policy making process here. So provincial government and different departments are all busy drafting policies in different ways. So there are a large number of officials involved in what you might call policy making. And so there's been a linked training program. There's been, I always think of it as the handbook, but it's really called the guidelines. There's been production of formal guidelines. If you have a look, and I think some of the links are available later if anyone wants them, but if you have a look at the government website, those how-to guidelines are very specific. They really are kind of talking you through the processes. We are at an interesting stage at the moment where it's not necessarily clear where some government funding is coming from and to what extent there is financial support within government for the ongoing, really hands-on support that EIS will need. So these things aren't cast in stone. There is always some variety that kicks in over time, and we are waiting to see how the financial investment will continue. But the structure is very much there, and there's beginning to be a really growing a body of experience of how this works and how to do the assessments that are required as part of the EIS system. So that expertise is accumulating all the time.
Sounds wonderful. Really, really interesting. I want to go to some of the questions that have come in the Q&A channel. So first of all, a question from Deborah. And hers is about implementation, and I was very struck as well by the emphasis on planning for implementation in the framework, not just the development of policy, but really evidence-informed planning for its implementation. And Deborah says, as an implementer, sometimes I find the language of evidence hard to engage with. I'd be interested in how the translation from evidence to implementation occurred in South Africa.
Very interesting. And I'm not sure I know the full answer. This is where I wish I had my fellow panelists sitting beside me and I could refer to them on questions. What I can say is that language is really important. And one of the things we've learned most by co-producing evidence with government colleagues is that we've got our language all wrong, and we need to learn more from the terminology that people are using when trying to implement these policies. And we actually wrote a paper together, myself and one of our government colleagues, around tensions and terminology, and how it's largely been driven from an academic perspective. It's very typical that my colleague introduced me as a professor, but I didn't call her director. And we often have academic titles that are not being matched by government titles. We often have academics turn to very technical language when they want to exclude anybody from a conversation. So there's been a number of reflections on that, and we're not there by any means. I think the implementation within the CS system is really crucial, and it's really striking, and particularly really important that you can have a beautiful policy, and we have them here too. All over the world, we have beautiful policies, but they can't be implemented.
Absolutely, and that's such an important focus. And I was interested in what you were saying there about the ways in which the academic or research generating community also needs to change. And your example of the emphasis on the use of academic titles and not equivalent titles for other people. I must say that your respect for your colleagues in government and in policy making just comes through so strongly, and is so important. But I mean, have you started to see changes in the way in which the academic community is operating and engaging? I mean, are they getting better at understanding how evidence needs to be sort of formulated or packaged or translated to make it fit for informing decision making? Have there been moves to sort of involve academics directly in policy making, those sorts of relationships developing?
So what's been fantastic around this is that it's been driven by our government colleagues. And I kind of hinted at a matchmaking approach, which is perhaps kind of colloquial term, but it's been driven by colleagues in government. So research director in government who's being asked what's the evidence on a particular policy area. And she now has processes for engaging with academics and seeking out academics who can share information, particularly around the evidence base and not just a single study, but to come on board and join her team that sits within government and advise and input and integrate evidence. So I think there has been a shift, and it's being driven from within government. There's also, academia is slower on the uptake, if I'm honest. So there is a slower process coming in where we're seeing an increasing number of research organizations begin to join this conversation and this process. And perhaps one of the most striking things is being our National Research Foundation has just formed a research impact task force to start to think more about the research that they commission. You know, they're the largest national funder of research within the country, and they are now engaging with many of these issues. So I think it's probably fair to say academia has been slow on the uptake, but we're getting there, and we are being driven by our government colleagues.
Excellent, and that's a real call to arms to all of us involved in generating evidence, I think, as well. There's another question here from Mary, and she says, we lose sight so often of what's not okay, even though that's what often motivated all of us to get involved in this work. Commercial and political realities overtake so much research and policy work. How do you keep the human priorities current and centred in your own work, and how have you seen that evolving in government?
Very interesting. So I think on a very personal level, I live in an extraordinary city, and we've seen it worsen over COVID. There's poverty and inequality all around me. And I have young people coming and asking me for jobs on a daily basis. I have people who are hungry asking me for food. I have all sorts of inequality. It's very stark. And South Africa's apartheid government was very good at building walls. Spatial planning was designed to ensure that the wealthy didn't have to see poverty. So you do have to open your eyes a bit and try and see past those large walls that do still exist. But a lot of it is a daily reality of what I experience. Another part of it has come from my fantastic team at the Africa Centre for Evidence, which is really committed to being value-driven. And John spoke earlier about emotions and values driving politics. And I believe really that they drive research and evidence too. And I think we need to check our emotions sometimes, but I think being value-driven is a really important thing. And I think it really does keep us on track to ensure that we're making a difference. So I thank my colleagues who challenge us. You know, some of our new colleagues who joined us recently said, you know, your vision says you're tackling poverty and inequality. Explain again how what I'm doing is making a difference. And it caused us to pause and interrogate that. So it's largely through those around me.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant. And it was very striking as your colleagues were describing SEIS, how they talked about the imperative to consider how a policy would impact differentially on different communities. Can you say a bit more about how the framework is used to address structural inequality and to inform a real kind of equity-driven approach to policy making? Maybe give an example or say a bit more about how that happens.
There were two lovely examples that Polani gave in the conversation I had with her, and unfortunately we weren't able to show the full length of the clip. One of them was around setting up new digital policies around digital divide across the country. And she talked about how when you look at a set of different evaluations and different data and investment, you quickly understand, and you know, we talk about digital divide in the UK, it's extraordinarily exacerbated here. So, and we found this with COVID. So many of my colleagues in London, when they were told that they had to work at home, picked up their laptops, walked home and plugged in the Wi-Fi. When my colleagues here in Johannesburg had to do that, many of them were not staying in the city at all. And some of them who were staying in the city didn't have access even to phone signal. So data is expensive. And so Pulani describes how in the development of that policy and the collation of evidence to help to shape the kind of ongoing, and this is still in process within policymaking in South Africa, but how they began to understand not just who had access to data and the internet and connectivity, but also the differing costs and how often the poorer you were and the least well connected you were, the more you had to pay. And so she describes beautifully in that interview how the different strands of evidence on a related different issues, when you actually put up inequality and interrogate the new policy proposals within a frame of inequality, you learn all sorts of new things and you can shape the policy in that process. She gave a second example, which was fascinating to me because it's only emerging now. But through the creation of a SEIS unit, it means that there is one funnel that these policies are going through. So it's one team that gets to see the assessments that are taking place. And she had a fascinating insights into issues of gender, because a number of related policies that may not explicitly be about gender and women's rights are touching on it. So she's beginning to understand how employment and subsidies might shape women, but also about how COVID grants might be shaping women. So there's something new that I don't think we've understood yet, but she personally is experiencing, where she's seeing these different assessments coming through and seeing cross-cutting issues and being able, I hope, in time to feed that back to the policymaking framework.
That sounds like such important work and an incredibly important and effective driver, really helpful examples there. I've been very struck, I mean, first of all, about how COVID has highlighted the kind of systemic inequalities, but also how slow, certainly in the UK, the system has been to anticipate, having seen those inequalities in relation to the first experience of COVID, how slow the system has been to anticipate that those same inequalities are going to create more inequity at the next stage of COVID as well. And, you know, you're thinking about vaccination, for example, how slow the system was to recognize that there was going to be, there were a number of different sort of barriers to different groups in their access to vaccination. And, you know, we're just sort of failing to anticipate that. And so it's terrific to hear about a framework for policy making that really does encourage that kind of proactive thinking. I want to go to another Q&A from the chat. And this one's from Peter, who says, thank you for this fascinating presentation. Do you have any examples of occasions where the outcome of evidence-informed decision-making process conflicts with the political or public position on a particular policy, and how the various decision-making institutions have responded to that?
It's really tricky, isn't it? So I think largely some of the areas that I've been working, absolute credit must go to our colleagues within the centre of government who have negotiated this space. So sometimes people ask me, as someone who produces evidence, how do I disseminate, how do I overcome maybe political opposition? And the answer is largely that I'm working with colleagues who are working on that problem all the time. So within the centre of government, there are senior officials, they're called outcome facilitators. I think that job title might have changed recently, but outcome facilitators whose jobs are to try and ensure that particular outcomes within our national development plan are being delivered by line departments. And those outcome facilitators play a crucial role in the relationship between the line department, the centre of government, and those of us who are supporting the collation of evidence. And so in the example of human settlements, we were able to collate the evidence using a framework, and development of the framework and agreement of the framework took at least as long as collation of the evidence, because we wanted our government colleagues to buy into the framework, for it to reflect the goals they're trying to achieve, the outcomes that are within the National Development Plan and the options that they're considering. And then we collated the evidence using very neutral steps, or as neutral as we could make and as explicit around bias as we could. And then in presenting the evidence back to them, it was already in a framework that was a format that was useful to them. And it was much easier for them to see that the white paper that was being put before Cabinet didn't have any evidence. That row was largely empty. And so it was a very kind of neutral and explicit way. There are examples of greater conflict and how advocates have had to use evidence, and the treatment action campaign around HIV and AIDS in South Africa used evidence to challenge government, and were eventually successful and contributed to saving the lives of millions of South Africans. So there have been a range of different approaches. It isn't always conflict free.
Yeah, absolutely. Evidence is never conflict free, is it? It's so imbued with power, and it's constantly contested space, and quite rightly so. Ruth, that has just been absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much. You've given us loads of terrific examples, and I think really described a shift from a kind of push focus on let's get evidence to decision makers, why aren't they using it, to a real pull focus where policymakers are absolutely wanting to use evidence, and it's the evidence generating community that needs to change and perhaps needs to sort of run a little bit faster to catch up. That has just been absolutely fabulous. Your vision for South Africa for 2030 as well will stay with me, and the resonance of your "it's not okay" messages. That has just been absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much. So, well, folks, if you like that, then do listen to John Thwaite's presentation if you weren't able to catch it earlier today. We've got a terrific panel coming up this afternoon on evidence and policy making as well. There was a panel just now on research initiatives in development contexts, which I think will resonate with a lot of what Ruth has been saying, and also a discussion group that sounded really lively on evidence and policy. Ruth, again, thank you so very much indeed. And folks, we've now got 3 panels and just 2 discussion sessions coming up. So please make your choice over those. Then we'll have a break, more panels and discussions, and then an invited panel and keynote for the rest of the day. So Ruth, again, thank you so much.